I hope that everybody is doing well here today. And this is exciting. This is chapter 19 of Tragedy and Hope. This is our next to the last chapter. And this is entitled The New Era, 1957 to 1964. And it is broken into three main categories here: the growth of nuclear stalemate, the disintegrating superblocks, and the eclipse of colonialism. There's some little subsections in there, but forgive me, I don't have my note in front of me, but I do believe that Graeme is leading off the discussion here.
Yes, hi Melissa.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, thanks. And you?
Good. I'm okay. I'm all right. Are you moved? I know you had a big move.
Yeah, we've been
unpacking.
We've been busy for the last couple of weeks. We've been on the move, and we are still unpacking at the minute. We've got quite a number of books. I think we've got about 3, maybe 2.5 to 3 tons of books. We've been
oh my goodness.
So we're a bit of a we're bookworms.
Well, that's good for you to take this on in the midst of what I know is a really big project. So, but I will just turn it over to you and let you. Yeah. All right.
Yes. Well, since it's the new year, I thought I would start by letting the people know about a Scottish tradition, certainly in the northeast of Scotland, and we'd call that a first footing, and that meant that you crossed over the threshold of the new year. That would be the first foot over the threshold of somebody's house. So that meant you were visiting your family or friends on New Year's Day, so on the 1st, and so you would see lots of people walking the streets, and the tradition was that you would bring a gift, and that basically means you put a foot over the threshold and wish the household good luck for the new year. And so even in the rain and the wind and the sleet, because Scottish weather's not too great, you'd see lots of people walking on the street, and I think that's an ancient tradition from the Highland peoples of Scotland, because when they visited a house, they would bless the people and bless the house, and they would bless the walls and the roof and the animals. And the reason for this was that they were protecting the house and the family and all the belongings of the family against evil, because they knew evil existed in many forms. So I'm bringing a blessing to this house.
Thank you.
Yep. It's a first footing for me.
All right, that's excellent.
Yeah, so before finding Alan, I never really read books. So I kind of realized after reading Alan's books that I was ignorant in most things. So I've begun a journey of collecting books. So that's why I've got about 3 tons of books, and I'm traveling all over with them. So they're very important, I think. And yeah, Tragedy and Hope. I think I got my copy back in 2016, and I never really read it cover to cover. I used it as a reference book, and I did read certain sections of it, maybe about 20 or 30%. So it's been a journey for me reading this cover to cover. I mean, it's a fantastic book. It's full of information I mean, you could spend a whole lifetime researching it, and it's been a real foundation. And I think Melissa, your guest, Rick, last night said it's a foundation builder. You know, it's laying the foundations when you read something like this. So I'm still on that journey of trying to find information. So let's see if we can make sense of this. So I think I'm going to be covering the growth of nuclear stalemate, and then Dan's going to be taking over on the disintegrating superblocks in Latin America. I'm going to come back in with the Far East, and I think Melissa's going to finish off with the eclipse of colonialism. So.
Oh, was that the section I was supposed to cover?
The eclipse of...
Just kidding.
I think so. Am I meant to be doing the Far East? Because I've never been to Japan or China.
Yeah, no. You got it. You got the breakdown correct. That's good.
Good. So that's a little introduction. But yeah, so Quigley tells us here, the start of chapter 19, that 1953 to 1963 was the most critical period in history, and we only survived by good luck and good sense. I suppose that depends on whose perspective you look at it from. So 1963 era brought a relaxation of the Cold War, so the US versus the SU, which brought economic prosperity, but also social disorganization and ideological confusions. So there was a shift in American politics, he tells us, from the John Foster Dulles strategy of massive retaliation to the Kennedy Democrat administration of graduated deterrence. So this paradigm shift, because they love paradigm shifts, brought a balance of terror, because the two great superpowers, the SU and the US, the SUS, at the same time achieved intercontinental thermonuclear weaponry. And I just thought I'd go back to chapter 17 here, and Quigley writes, in my book, it's page 668. He says, the whole purpose of secrecy in government should not be to keep information from other states. This is almost impossible, but to make it as difficult as possible for other states to get certain information, so that when they do get such restricted information, it will be so intermingled with other information and misinformation that it cannot be evaluated promptly enough to do them much good. Any espionage system gets more information than it can handle rapidly. Any country should assume that the enemy has all its own secret information. The lessons of past history fully support this assumption. Following every war, the discovery is made that the enemy during the war had every other state's most cherished secrets. In fact, the most successful kind of counter-espionage work is achieved not by preventing access to secrets, but by permitting access to information which is not true. And isn't that a true statement? That's what we're up against today, with total misinformation. And so America's defense was dominated by a new look, a new clearing out the old to bring in the new. And we know science, the eye of sense, sees clearly through everything. So this new look in theory meant a reduction in defense budget, and that economic foreign aid was decreasingly emphasized. And I just love the way the vague terminology here, that economic foreign aid was decreasingly emphasized. It doesn't really mean anything. And I mean, Quigley goes on to tell us that massive amounts of military aid from the West has gone into mercenary groups and guerrillas. So I think these are ancient techniques of radicalizing the peasants. And this new look, I see this from another perspective. Take the big three at Yalta, with Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. I mean, Roosevelt is a German word. for a rosy world. Churchill is the temple on the mount. And Stalin, well, Stahl is steel. And even in Russian, Stalin means man of steel. So he had lots of steel in him. He brought down the Iron Curtain. And Churchill, the church on the temple on the little island there, he defeated the devil incarnate. And of course, those rosy tinted glasses of American idealism, where we need heroes to save the world. So we now have a new look, which was rather dull. And anyone not seeing in Dulles' black and white view and not joining America was condemned to darkness. So in Dulles' world of 2 blocks, Quigley tells us, he would set up paper barriers. And I took this to mean laws and treaties and bureaucratic organizations. And these came in the form of NATO, Centro, and CETO. And you just have to love this names here. I mean, anybody familiar with Alan Watts' work, these symbols just jump out at you. I mean NATO, they even reverse that in their symbology today with OTAN, which is Aton or Adonai, the head of a Centro CETO. And you'll see all of the ancient councils sitting, even the modern councils still sit in this semicircle where they all face a seat in the center. So, and of course, Alan tells us about this word. The head of this seat is called a Nazi or a Nazi. So under NATO, we shall atone for our sins. So it's interesting what Quigley says here about Dulles. Dulles cared little about the military strength, economic prosperity, or political democracy of the states forming this paper ring around the Soviet bloc, you see, because they don't really care for democracy. They know democracy is a sham. They have no time for it. And we can see this today with NATO really arming all these states around Russia. So that's very interesting. We can see the pieces of the grand chessboard being moved into place. I mean, all of your states around the border, Estland and Estonia and Lithuania and Poland are being, heavily weaponized through NATO. Massive amounts of armaments are going into there, and of course we've got the Ukraine war with Russia. So we're seeing this, and we can really see the pieces of the grand chessboard here. So this new look, a nuclear, was being whipped up by a balanced terror, evenly spread across the world. And that's what I really mean. I think that's what they really mean here by this balance of terror. So if you think about it, there's massive amounts of media propaganda here to create this frenzy. I mean, it really says to me that all these governments of the world are complicit with these techniques. I think we've been under a world government for a long time. There's no doubt. And I think Quigley tells you this over and over in this book. So the American weapons capability now shifts from intermediate range ballistic missiles to intercontinental ballistic missiles, which I'm going to refer to as ice beams, because they had a cooling effect on Soviet strategy. And the Soviets had their higher beams, because they could launch their rockets higher. And we've seen this. Quigley tells us that America had a cooling off with Turkey, while the Soviets were secretly installing their higher beams into Cuba. Quigley tells us the Cuban Missile Crisis led to the alleged American-Soviet stalemate. So I'm reading from a book here, so just bear with me. Again, it's interesting what Quigley says here. So the Soviet stalemate, by inhibiting the use of the power of each, permitted third powers to escape to a considerable extent from the need to have power sufficient to back up their actions. This meant that third states could undertake actions which their own power could not in itself justify or enforce. That is to say that the superpower stalemate allowed third states a freedom of action beyond their own intrinsic powers. Thus, Indonesia could attack Malaya, China could attack India, Pakistan, although allied to the United States, could be cozy with the Red China, Cyprus could defy Turkey, Egypt could attack Yemen, France could defy the United States, Romania could flirt with Peking, and Britain or Spain could trade with Castro's Cuba, without the superpowers feeling free to use their own real strengths to obtain what they wanted, since most of their strengths were neutralized, opposing each other. And so he goes on to say, one significant consequence of this situation was the almost total collapse of the system of international law that had been formulated in the 17th century by the writers of like Grotius. That system of international law had regarded the state as the embodiment of sovereignty, an organization of of political power on a territorial basis. The criteria for the existence of such a sovereign state had been its ability to defend its boundaries against external aggression and to maintain law and public order among its inhabitants inside those boundaries. I think Quigley's given us a good clue here, or spelling it out, what the sovereign state is and how they create these borders and arm these borders, and more importantly, they give themselves the right to create laws within those borders and keep public order. So I think that's important. Quigley's telling us what the sovereign state really is here. And then he goes on to say, by 1964, a consequence of the power stalemate of the Cold War, dozens of states, such as the Congo, which could perform neither of these actions, were recognized as states by the superpowers and their allies, and achieved this recognition in international law by being admitted to the United Nations. Yeah, and I really see here the United Nations as being used to create all these different factions, this diverse groups of different states. And so he goes on here to say there was this development culminated over 50 years of destruction of the old established distinctions of international law, such as the distinctions between war and peace, destroyed by the Cold War, which was neither between belligerents and neutrals, destroyed by British economic warfare in World War I, or between civilians and combatants, destroyed by submarine warfare and city bombing. And for me, we can really see here how this really tells me that we're creating all these. Quigley's given us a clue here to creating all these NGOs and minority groups. I think he makes it clear here as he goes on. So nuclear stalemate in the Cold War context made it possible for political organizations with almost none of the traditional characteristics of a state not only to be recognized as states, but to act in irresponsible ways and to survive on economic subsidies won from one bloc by threatening to join or merely to accept subsidies from the other bloc. So as a consequence of this situation, all the realities of international affairs by 1964 had become covered with thick layers of law, theories, practices, and agreements, and had no relationship to reality at all. Under the American-Soviet stalemate, third states could rise and act against each other because the two superpowers were too busy cancelling each other out. But we know these third states have been armed by both of the superpowers. This led to a collapse of international law, and Quigley tells us exactly why states have been created. To create borders which need to be guarded against enemies, and more importantly to maintain law and order of the inhabitants of these states. So under the guise of security, nation states have been created so they can legally tax the peoples under economic laws. That's what sovereign means, to be ruled, to be lorded over, to be governed. The United Nations has allowed political organisations, which is just a nation state, to be recognised as sovereign states. They can act in irresponsible ways and survive on subsidies from the superpowers, which means off the backs of the peoples. This created laws and theories and practices and agreements which have no relationship to reality, Quigley tells us. So for me, Quigley shows us what the UN was set up to do by forming NGOs, minority groups, created and funded by the large trust foundations, which are also recognised as having sovereign rights as a nation states, and that's why they produce mandates or mission statements. You can take in the lobby groups there, they're all connected, we're run by 1,000 councils. Quigley then goes on and tells us that this black or white view of Dulles was being replaced by a new multi-world bloc. You can see the rise of this new third world bloc, which we can see is the UN. But we do know that Dulles was controlling a group of gangsters from central control in Switzerland, which included Hjalmar Schacht. He was the president of the Reichsbank for Hitler's Germany, and Schacht in German is chess. So that's interesting with Quigley's view of Dulles and his black and white viewpoint of the world. So also Dulles was heavily connected with the World Council of Churches, who were very influential in proclaiming that the whole of the German state was to blame for World War II, and also I think Carl Gustav Jung had dealings with Dulles as well. So Quigley doesn't tell us about that, but we've got other documentation that tells us about that. So Quigley goes on to tell us that the two superpowers were converging on increasingly parallel courses, and it's like Alan said, it's capi come fasci. I don't see any difference in these ideologies. I think there's one agenda, and Quigley does spell that out for us. He does tell us. So Quigley goes on to say that the growing diversity and the disintegration of the superblocks was only possible under the threat of nuclear destruction and an equally horrible biological weaponry. So lots of fear-based propaganda there. And Alan told us in his Sweet Liberty broadcast about what Karl Marx had said about how they would get to a world communism. First it would be through creating nation states, and so it was through nationalism and merging all these small countries into one main country, giving them a common culture and education. And I mean, I really see this as it's a global movement. Alan's mentioned this a number of times. Things happen within a few months all over the world, and through World War I and World War II, we see that the whole globe is converging into this agenda. We can really see it clearly. And Alan said that Russia took over dozens of small countries, and they were given one common culture. and one education. I do see that. And then he said, this is what Marx said: then we shall work on bringing together all of the countries through international, regional corporations. There you go, there's the UN being set up to recognise these political organisations, which are just nation states or NGOs or minority groups, it doesn't really matter. And they'll work to bring these corporations into a world body. And Alan rightly said, this is exactly where we are. Karl Marx was funded by the big boys in London. He lived and died there, and I have a copy of the Communist Manifesto, which I purchased for €1 in a second-hand a Protestant tower block book sale on my travels. It was printed in 1945. Picked up a lot of good books there, actually. It has a foreword by Marx and Engels dated 1872 from London, so it's clear. Alan was right again. This is exactly what they've done also with the creation of the United States of Europe, as it was called by Winston Churchill. So it's clear. It's exactly what Alan says. They're creating nation states as a pretext, a unified bloc. Certainly on my own studies, looking into the dusty old books, it does look to me that ancient Europe has always been under some kind of world government. Absolutely, we can see that, and there's been a clear east-west divide of Europe. There's nothing new in this at all for me. I see it in the history books. So we get into the space age now, and the big Soviet rocket boosters, the higher beams. I really think this was just a big world fireworks show, and it's so schizophrenic, creating massive fear and panic. At any moment, the world could be destroyed by a nuclear war. Really pushing the fear through the media. I mean, build yourself a fallout bunker, hide under your desks. There's communists in the Senate, and then they quickly switch it to oh no, the Russians are not so bad. Look, Khrushchev, he's denouncing Stalin. He must be a good guy. And of course, Khrushchev was being made into a media star. It's pure theatre, and Khrushchev was the good guy. He blasted us into space. But really, I mean, I would suggest to anybody to watch Elmer Land's documentary. Melissa has posted this a few occasions. NASA, Nazis, and Hollywood. And it really shows you that the three are completely interlinked. And it's a great documentary. And I had actually read another Alan Watt suggested book a few years back now. Got a hold of Ralph Rennie's NASA Mooned America. So I really have a hard time believing that any human or dog or monkey or or anybody has gone into space. It's just a huge fireworks show for the whole world to see, and they've been pushing the alien agenda for an awful long time too. Yeah, Bill Cooper said something along the lines of, I don't doubt that they are in space, but not with the technology they're showing us. And I think I agree with Bill. He also said in his book, Behold a Pale Horse. Bill served in the Navy, and whilst he was on lookout duties with another seaman, they saw an aircraft rise out of the sea, just levitated in midair, came out of the sea, and then in a split second it just disappeared into the atmosphere. And I think him and his mate, they both looked at each other, questioned each other, acknowledged what they saw, and continued looking. They were trained to do this. And I suppose they questioned their sanity as well. and then the same thing happened again some 5-10 minutes later or so. He said this craft was about the size of a bus, and it made no sound. It just came up silently and just shot off into the atmosphere. This happened twice in the space of a few minutes, he said. So they're trained to see and say. So they both reported this to the captain, and when they got on shore, some very intimidating agents interviewed them and basically forced them to report that they had saw nothing. And this was in the 60s. So I think they're miles ahead with technology, but there's definitely no doubt that the pictures that they're showing us and the information that they're giving us on many things, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. Not for me. I think the most important thing from Quigley's book here is the social changes that brought on with the space race. Yeah, this highly entertaining confusions and contradictions just make people completely highly suggestible, and Quigley spells out the techniques here. So NASA were receiving $5 billion of government funding a year, and the education system in the US and the Soviet system were totally revolutionized towards big tech. And for me, I can see this happened on a global scale, not just in the US and in the Soviet. But again, Quigley reminds us of the convergence of the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet system. Then Quigley goes on to tell us about Khrushchev. He turns into the bad guy again. He wants a settlement of the Berlin problem. So again, we're building up tensions, which led to the Berlin Wall. And then Quigley makes some comments about the collapse of the Great Leap Forward in China. Quigley states that Khrushchev was blown away by the American farming industry, and I do know Alan mentioned this a number of times, that he thought the Americans always looked the healthiest. He's given a few examples of this. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure of the American farming system. Maybe Melissa can comment on that. But what I definitely see with the mass farming is that it's driving the peasants off the land in search for work in the industrialised towns and cities. So they're being driven into this technological revolution, forcing them onto a new economic system. But at the same time, because of high costs in heavy farming and machinery and massive amounts of bureaucracy and red tape, the small farmers are closing down. I'm not sure about in America, but it's definitely happening in Europe, and of course the huge agri businesses are just ready there to fill in the gaps, because these huge businesses, in fact all of the farming industry, is only surviving on subsidies, and that is taxpayers' money again. So we are paying for the food at least twice, and through inflation and taxation we're just paying more and more and more all the time for basic necessities. You can see that the price of food is definitely on the increase, and I don't see any stop to it, to be honest. So Quigley then goes on to talk about the booming industry in Germany, but like Alan said, countries are built up not because of special traits or hard work or superhuman powers, but by allowing certain freedoms, cutting off the red tape. And in the east of Germany, Quigley's talking about the booming West Germany, but most of East Germany's products were exported. And I think Dan suggested in the case of German history, certainly to do with World War II, the historian David Irvin, Hitler's War, that really puts things into perspective. What Quigley writes about World War II. I would also suggest the work of Germar Rudolph. He's a chemist. He spent a huge part of his life studying the records that have been left behind, and really none of these authors are denying that inhumane atrocities were carried out. They certainly did, but they occurred on both sides, and they've gone through the documents. Hundreds and hundreds of records were kept by the Germans, the highly efficient bureaucratic German system. They've gone through them and they've published them. So I think for me the term ally is very apt, because they've all lied. There's no doubt about it, because what happened in Germany and to Germany is appalling, disgusting. It's horrifying, but this type of thing has gone on all down through history. No doubt about it. Alan said history is a horror show. But Germany was burned down, just incinerated, and there was no specific military strategic locations in any of these towns and cities. No way. This was just pure slaughter of innocent people, and Quigley calling this, the people's just being pushed into and being driven into economic prosperity, a booming trade. Calls this a miracle. I think it's disgusting. Again, the schizophrenic thing about East Germany, they always keep a class of people in a state of poverty. It's a great incentive to keep people working for the system, no doubt. Most of the goods in East Germany, I think Quigley says somewhere along the lines of 80% of the goods were exported into Russia or other communist states, just like China, but they were definitely kept in a totalitarian system of total surveillance. But the West were told about this, and they were informed of this through the media. It was really, you have to really take your hat off to their media campaigns. I mean, the West Germans really thought they were free. Arbeit macht frei. But I've told the people here that everybody was watched and listened to through the telephone or through the radio or through the TV. Absolutely no doubt for me. But keeping a peoples in a certain class of people in a state of poverty is an ancient technique. They did the same to the Highlanders. They kept them in utter poverty. So joining the military looked like a good thing. At least you'd get 3 square meals a day. Get a roof over your head, and you get a nice military uniform, which was the kilt. But in a case of a Holocaust, I would advise people to again search for the work that Melissa posted on Chris Fogarty, the Perfect Holocaust, about the Irish Holocaust, and the Irish were yeah, it's been a long time. It's been a long time of tyranny and murder. But they were starved. Their food was basically taken from them legally, of course, because in Ireland and Scotland, and to be honest, none of us have legal standing in this system. We're all classed as cattle, really. But the British military basically stole their food under arms and shipped it into Britain to feed their military, and shipped it all over Europe. So that's a true Holocaust, very similar to what happened in Scotland. Very similar. So maybe I can attach some links about some good talks with Chris Fogarty. The Irish seem to be standing up a lot more than the Scots. It does seem that way. But Quigley goes on to tell us about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and just reading through that, I just think it's Big Daddy versus giant haystacks. And Big Daddy, I remember when I was young, that was on the TV, and Big Daddy used to get the fans to shout easy, 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 and I really think that was to mock the public about how easy they were to fool. It's pure theatre. And Quigley finishes off the section telling us that America flexed their big daddy muscles, and the giant haystacks of the Soviets backed off, because Big Daddy always won in the end. So, but Quigley does tell us that war, or the threat of war, whether it's real or imaginary, will always prevail.
Okay, well, I have to just say before Dan starts that I like your word connections that you shared. Those are real good. Yeah. So I think what Dan and I are going to do is he has made some slides, which will be part of the visual presentation. And so he didn't want to run slides at the same time he was talking, and I don't blame him. So I think we're going to, he'll talk and I will run slides and hopefully keep up.
My section was the Disintegrating Superblocks, and with a focus on Latin America. That was the title slide. We'll go to the next slide. And this slide here, or this quotation here, I pulled up from my notes that I collect now, and this one was from 2017. It was my first note, and this sort of is when I started I've been doing it for quite a while, but this, I think 2017 marked my complete transformation from print to digital. The newspapers were, I've been noticing at that time that the media was slipping, and that they were advocating not reporting. So I made the switch to digital. So I'd like to read this quote. The narcissistic orientation is one in which one experiences real only that which exists within oneself, while the phenomena in the outside world have no reality in themselves, but are experienced only from the viewpoint of their being useful or dangerous to one. The opposite pole to narcissism is objectivity. It is the faculty to see other people and things as they are, objectively, and to be able to separate the objective picture from a picture which is formed by one's desires and fears. The faculty to think objectively is reason. The emotional attitude behind reason is that of humility. To be objective, to use one's reason, is possible only if one has achieved an attitude of humility. If one has emerged from the dreams of omniscience and omnipotence, which one has as a child. Love, being dependent on the relative absence of narcissism requires the development of humility, objectivity, and reason. And that's from Eric Fromm, and it's The Art of Loving. And when I saw this quote, I thought of Al, things as they are. A couple of other things with narcissism and the evil triad, which I know that the group knows what they are. But if you start combining this with Bernays, Machiavellianism, as well as things like AI, this is where the problems start. And the other thing that's really interesting, and I call it Harari's paradox, it seems to me that all the people that are capable of objectivity are excluded from the analysis of the data they so covet. So we're on to the next slide. Where this chapter fits in the context of the chapter, the chief consequence of the nuclear stalemate was that it made possible a greatly increased diversity in the world. Superpowers were not even in a position to press their desires on the members of their own blocs. The neutrals could act with growing neutrality or by increased irresponsibility, and consequently we should be concerned with the disintegration of the superblocks and the growth of neutralism. And those strange symbols you see, this is from paperback 7, page 703 at the top. This, I guess, summarizes how this section I'm doing fits in, and it just shows you the continuity. So are we on to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay. This is just basic stuff, but it's really important. And you can find this anywhere, but I'll just read it. A thriving country or civilization needs a stable government, a robust economy, rule of law, strong education, and social cohesion. The wealth of a nation is the productivity of its people. So, if we reflect now on where we are, this is a good statement. And really, when you look at this, wherever we are in the world today, we have questions, particularly with stable government, a robust economy. For example, the rules on the ground don't seem to match the numbers on the television. A rule of law with kangaroo courts all over the place. Education and just social cohesion. Just remember Abraham Lincoln, a nation divided cannot stand, and Adam Smith, the wealth of a nation is the productivity of its people. Next slide. Excuse me. 4 basic issues facing Latin America: increased birth rates and increased longevity, putting pressure on a limited food supply, migration to the cities, increasing crime rates, and emphasizing inadequate education and healthcare and disrupting family life. We have inadequate and unconstructive ideological constructs being replaced by destructive and more violent doctrines, and increased military and domestic weaponization to manage and implement aforementioned issues, page 703. And if we reflect on our current situation, you can see a lot of similarities. Facts and figures. I'm just taking a drink of water. Brazil had really high inflation, ranging from 40 to 70% in the early 60s. Average per capita income in Latin America was $253 annually in 1960. The average person in Latin America, over 80% of them receive only $53 a year. 100 families own 90% of the native-owned wealth. Of that, 30 families own 72%. 66% of Latin America land owned by 10% of the families, and 50% of the population is too young or too old to be considered productive, and 66% are considered illiterate. And we're on to facts and figures continued. Infant mortality in 1960 varied between 25 and 35%, and regional life expectancy was 44 years versus 66 years. This section I call Eloquent Prejudice, and as we go through it, we'll see it, and maybe I'll stop to see what people think, and maybe ask a question or two. In England, there were groups benefiting from this inequality who eschewed all self-indulgence, luxury, or ostentatious display of wealth, and systematically invested their growing incomes in creating new and more efficient patterns of utilization of resources. That's on page 705 bottom. And the wealth and income of Latin America in absolute quantities is so great and is so inequitably controlled and distributed that there is an enormous accumulation of incomes far beyond their consumption needs in the hands of a small percentage of Latin Americans. Much of the excess incomes are wasted, hoarded, or merely used for wasteful competition in ostentatious social display. This, we shall see, is largely due to the deficiencies of Latin American personalities and character. So, I don't know about you, but this doesn't sit well with me as a human being. And we'll go on to the next slide. Throughout this section, his theory of social evolution, he calls it the Pakistani Peruvian axis. And the problem of finding constructive patterns for Latin America is much more difficult than the problem of finding constructive priorities. One reason for this is the unconstructive patterns that now prevail in Latin America are deeply entrenched as a result of centuries and even millennia of persistent background. In fact, the Latin American patterns must be changed because today they are leading to social and cultural disruptions that are not really Latin American in origin, or even Iberian for that matter, but are Near Eastern and go back for some of their aspects for 2,000 years or more. As a general statement, we might say that Latin American cultural pattern, including personality patterns and general outlook pattern, is Arabic, while its social pattern is that of Asiatic despotism. The pattern as a whole, so prevalent today, not only in Latin America, but in Spain, Sicily, southern Italy, the Near East, and in the various other areas of the Mediterranean world, such as Egypt, that we may still call it the Pakistani Peruvian axis. For convenience of analysis, we shall divide it into the Asiatic despotism and the Arabic outlook. And we'll go to one more slide. It's Latin America dominated by Arabic traits. No real concern for the soil, the area, for workers, one's fellow man, or the community as a whole. The dominance of family connection and of masculine dominance with its dual standard of sexual morality, its cult of virility, its selflessness, self-indulgent lack of self-discipline, or of concern for others, and the whole Mediterranean view of politics as a system of exploitive personal relationships of an arbitrary and corrupt character, combining extortion, bribery, tax evasion, and total divorce from community spirit or personal responsibility for the welfare of others or of the nation. That's at page 709 at the bottom. These traits were further amplified by industrialization and the failure of the church. So just before we have a break or questions or discussion, I remember in my youth there was quite an effort in the school, the Catholic school system, to fund the local priests to go on trips to Guatemala, and they used to make money by collecting grocery slips that the children brought from their families. And I guess what they were using these grocery slips for was to generate marketing information on what families were buying. But in retrospect now, many years later, I find this whole little memory quite suspicious. So if we want to just take a little break, and does anybody have any questions or comments?
Hi, Dan. It's Darren here from SA. When I was reading this chapter, it just reminded me of a comment my brother made. He went to Argentina on a rugby tour, and he just came back, and the first thing he said was, these South American guys are very, very sexist, very, very male dominated. The women are, if you want a woman, you just say, hey, come here, you take her, you know. So first-hand experience from my brother does back up a little bit of what Quigley is saying.
I know it exists, but the way I'm looking at it is, if you want people to change, you have to view them differently and guide them towards that. It seems to me, like, I just find this suspicious based on the fact that Quigley was a worldly man, and it seems to me he was quite a nice person. He won a teacher, or the teacher of the year, the last 4 years that he taught, and that's usually not bestowed upon the idiot of the department. So I just, I'm just questioning this in the sense that, is he reflecting what the people above him are thinking? That's what I'm taking away from this, because I was mystified by the whole thing.
I agree with you, Dan. It's the same when he discusses the Russians. It's as if they are such a different group that they can't be human. It's that they don't seem to have any good traits, and he doesn't balance it off. So he's definitely remember he's educating the students for the CFR, so he's probably indoctrinating them with a certain point of view that suits the geopolitical goals of the CFR.
Yeah, I agree. It's just, he gives us these little subtleties in his writing, and I think this is one of the ways he's done it. But certainly, if any of his students are running into Lavrov these days, they're getting an education in diplomacy. So I'm not sure that the stereotype applies to all the Russians involved in the diplomatic corps. That's for sure. Thank you, Darren. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, so we'll move on. Oh,
Yes, I'd like to. Just, it's not quite on topic maybe, but the quote you had in the second slide, where it speaks about narcissists and the opposite being that one has objectivity. I'm trying to, oh yes, there you go, there's the screen. Objectivity and of course reason as well, and humility being kind of the, shall we say, antidote. This really brought to mind the chapter that Fiona and I did with regards to kind of the dominant reason that was being brought in, the cap of thinking in a very reason kind of logical way. However, the word reason here, I'm sure I would actually replace it with the word logic rather than reason. And yesterday I started listening to the talk from Alan Watt from the 22nd of October 2006. He has a discussion with Henrik and Palgram, and he says that they were talking about the age of reason, which was kind of brought in dominantly in the 60s, and that he sees it as a religion, because if you even look at the word reason, Ra, and which is one, which means God, and then sun, of course, so Ra meaning it is a religion in its own right. So what comes to mind, and what I'm starting to realize, especially with reading that chapter 16, is that they have pushed the thinking and the language of science towards a dominant reason, and with that, they have taken away morality and, shall we say, kind of the humanist, the spirit of it. And this quote that you've given, for me, is just bang on. And it aligns a lot with what Alan Watt said as well. Because another thing in that talk, he also mentions the god Athena and how she has a shield, which is the same as on the British coin. The old pennies used to have this shield with a spear, and behind the shield is the serpent. And if you look up all the shields, it's oftentimes with the Medusa. Okay, I'm going to get to my point now. But basically, the Medusa is there to kind of bring confusion so that we cannot see what reality really is. And this is where they are heading. They don't want us to see reality or have objectivity. And it really is all about how we perceive things. So what Quigley is talking about is, even though they've brought in the science and reason and the age of reason and all of that, it is all to influence our perception of being able to perceive reality. So just wanted to comment on that.
well, I think you're going to enjoy where our talk goes this afternoon. Sorry, this is all there's so many coincidences in this little journey that I've been on with this that it's eye-opening. So thank you very much for that comment. Any other? So we're on to slide 11. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. That's from our old friend Mark Twain. And what I've done here is I've just used, he did so many country breakdowns, but I chose Argentina because it's current. So in Argentina, as elsewhere among the Pakistani-Peruvian axis, especially in Spain, this tendency has fragmented social life and led to extremism. Even groups seem to have the most obvious common interests in Argentina, such as the armed forces or the urban middle classes, are hopelessly split and fluctuate from position to position. It is the splitting of these groups, especially of the middle classes, that has given such influence in Argentina to the labor unions on the left or the landlord group on the right. The middle classes in Argentina have been split into two political parties and that refused to cooperate. Together, they could pull at least half the total vote in any election, but instead each obtains a quarter or less of the total vote, and refusing to join each other must seek a majority by coalition with smaller external parties. Now, does this sound familiar? And at one point, I think in the in the 1800s, Argentina was a beautiful, productive country. It was definitely, there definitely were Italian families where I live, where half came to Canada and half went to Argentina. Just to give you put things in context. And so all of a sudden it was in trouble. It fell off the face of the earth. There was currency crisis. They had the spat in the Falkland Islands. And then all of a sudden they elect this person, Milei, which I believe is the short form for Milejkowski, which may or may not be Benjamin Netanyahu's Polish name. But he shows up and all of a sudden his government's elected and there's all these changes going on, and all of a sudden Argentina's been rescued. So I just find that the timing interesting. So we'll move on to the next slide. Yeah, and this is the same thing. Sound familiar, but this is a quote from page 714 at the bottom. The failure of Latin America to find solutions to its most urgent, real problems are thus much more fundamental than the cliches of political controversy, the complexion of governments, or the presence or absence of revolutionaries. The words left, center, or right mean little in terms of solutions to Latin America's problems, since disorganization, corruption, violence, and fraud are all endemic in all. Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia, Guatemala, and Cuba all suffer from the same issues. But does it sound familiar? And we'll move on to the next slide. So I've honed in on Guatemala and the United Fruit Company. This is a really important. I'll just say that this is where Che Guevara received his start, and Quigley. I'll give away some of where I'm going, but Quigley devoted one sentence to Che Guevara. So anyways, this is part of his background. The United Fruit Company became Chiquita Brands in the early 1980s. Juan Jose Arevalo, 1945 to 1950, and Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, 1950 to 1954, were presidents that initiated reform, which is long overdue, and they tried to provide it by becoming increasingly anti-American and pro-communist. Here's a few more stats about the situation. When they began, civil or political rights were almost totally unknown, and 142 persons, including corporations, owned 90% of the arable land. Free speech and press, legalized unions, and free elections preceded the work of reform, but opposition from the United States began as soon as it became clear that the Land Reform Act of June 1952 would be applied to the United Fruit Company. This called for a redistribution of uncultivated holdings above a fixed acreage or lands of absentee owners with compensation from 20-year 3% bonds equal to the declared tax value of the lands. About 400,000 acres of the United Fruit lands fell upon this new law and were distributed by the Guzman government to 180,000 peasants, and this is on paperback, page 716 at the bottom. So it was, this was a very, very poor country, and The leaders tried to improve it, and you would think that the United States would be behind it, but no. And we're on to the next slide. Enter the Dulles brothers. The actions against United Fruit were declared to be a communist penetration of the Americas, and John Foster Dulles, in a brief visit to the I think that's the overall American Summit meeting in Caracas in 1954, forced through a declaration condemning Guatemala. The Secretary of State left the execution of this condemnation to his brother, Allen Dulles, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, which soon found an American trained in American finance, Guatemalan Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, who was prepared to lead a revolt against Arbenz, with Americans' money and equipment and even some American volunteers to fly surplus planes. Armas mounted an attack with Guatemalan exiles from bases and two adjacent dictatorships, the Honduras and Nicaragua. And that's pages 716 and 717. And I'm just moving my screen here. The next slide, the Cuban disaster. So basically, Guatemala provided them with a template for managing Cuba, but unfortunately that template wasn't going to work. And I think before I get into the interesting part, I'll just take a pause and see if there's any questions or comments. Thanks. Okay, I guess we'll move on. So we'll move on to the Cuban disaster. The causes are as complex as most historical events, but if we oversimplify, we may organize them in the terms of two intersecting factors. One, the personality deficiencies of the Cubans themselves, such as their lack of rationality and self-discipline, their emotionalism and corruptibility. And two, the ignorance and ineptitude of the American State Department, which seemed to be incapable of dealing with Latin America in terms of the real problems of the area, but instead insists on treating it in terms of America's vision of the world, which is to say in terms of American political preconceptions and economic interests. And this sort of fits in with Quigley's thesis of institutional drift. The institutions start focusing on their own interests instead of on the interests of the people that they are supposed to serve or work for. The next slide, the rise of Castro. After Cuba obtained independence from Spain in 1898, it was under direct American influence until the abrogation of the Platt Amendment in 1934. With the establishment of the Good Neighbor Policy in 1933, Cuba was subjected to a succession and variety of failed governments, ending with the March 1952 coup of a ruthless Cuban Army Sergeant Fulgencio Batista. So that's the name you have to remember. The discontent against his rule manifested itself in an attempted revolt by a handful of youths led by 26-year-old Fidel Castro in eastern Cuba on July 26, 1953. The failure of the revolt resulted in Castro serving 2 years of imprisonment and more than a year of exile. But at the end of 1956, he landed with a handful of men on the coast of Cuba to begin guerrilla operations against the government. And that's at page 718 at the top. The revolution continues. As a direct result of the corruption and violence of the Batista regime, Castro received support from segments of the army and much of the middle class by receiving the necessary arms and financing. The revolution was unique due to Castro's fanatical thirst for power, his ruthless willingness to destroy property or lives in order to weaken the Batista regime, and the fact that the operation was from within Cuba rather than from abroad and from a rural base using peasants instead of urbanites. Castro's rebels weakened the economic and communication basis of the Batista government by destroying sugar plantations and utilities. That was page 718. And the juxtaposition of victory. So this was an observation. New Year's Day, 1959, Castro marched into Havana with, in 2 weeks, an additional and very ominous difference in this revolution appeared. The supporters of the Batista regime and dissident elements in Castro's involvement began to be executed by firing squads. But for a year, Castro's government carried on a reformist policy administered by its original supporters, the July 26th group, middle class and university student graduates. Military barracks were converted into schools. The militia was permanently established to replace the regular army. Rural health centers were set up. A full-scale attack was made on literacy or illiteracy. New schools were constructed. Urban rents were cut in half. Utility rates were slashed. Taxes were imposed on the upper classes. The beaches, once reserved for the rich, were open to all, and a drastic land reform was launched. What is the reason for the contrast? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Che Guevara. So let's move down here. So Castro, a tactician of revolution. Beneath this early and temporary bloom of well-being, many ominous signs appeared. Castro showed that he was a tactician of revolution, not a strategist of reconstruction. He immediately sought to export revolution to the rest of Latin America. Arms and guerrilla fighters were sent and lost in unsuccessful efforts to invade Panama, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Something was missing. Concomitantly, he improved relations with Russia, signing the McCoyan Agreement, which promised Cuban petroleum, arms, and other needs for its sugar. And although the price equivalent to the sugar was only 4 cents a pound at the time, when American was 6 cents. In June 1963, the world price reached 13, and Russia raised the price to 6 cents. Pre-Bay of Pigs. So, as part of the trade agreement with Russia, Castro obtained Soviet crude petroleum for Cuban sugar. When he insisted that American refineries in Cuba process the oil, they refused and were once seized by Castro. The United States struck back by reducing the Cuban sugar quota in the American market, which led step by step to Castro's sweeping nationalization of foreign-owned factories on the island. The United States retaliated by establishing a series of embargoes on Cuban exports to the United States. These controversies led Castro into an economic trap. Cuba lacked U.S. dollar reserves to buy other essential components that Russia could not provide, and this resulted in an economic decline that reduced the standard of living to at least a third below the Batista level. Pre-Bay of Pigs continued. In December 1960, the United States ceased diplomatic relations with Cuba, and the Eisenhower administration decided to use force to remove Castro. The decision was made a major error and led to a totally shameful fiasco. The project was to be a Dulles Brothers job, and its execution was largely in the hands of the CIA, which organized the expeditionary force from Cuban exiles, financed and armed them, and supervised their training in Guatemala and elsewhere. The Joint Chiefs of Staff approved the plan, and President Kennedy was persuaded to accept it after his inauguration, because the CIA argued that something must be done to remove Castro before his newly acquired Soviet equipment became operational. The president was assured that if matters were allowed to go on as they were, Castro would be strengthened in power and that the invasion would be a success because the Cuban people, led by an anti-Castro underground, would rise up against them after they heard of the landing. So, and just a point about the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the person just under the Joint Chiefs who was supposed to implement the plan was a gentleman by the name of Fletcher Prouty. The Bay of Pigs. The CIA refused to use either the anti-Castro underground in Cuba or the Cuban refugees in the United States in the invasion attempt, and kept all planning and control of the invasion in its own hands. The CIA launched the invasion without notifying the Cuban underground and kept the refugee committee locked up without communication for the week of the attack. Then the attack itself was bungled since it was aimed at an appropriate spot without eliminating Castro's air power and without provision for fighting it, and with the logistics for the whole tactical operation of the invasion at unbelievable level of incompetence. And I'll just touch on that. I'll keep just something I wanted to add, and I'll do it on this slide. As a result of these errors, the 1,500 men landed at the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba on April 17, 1961, and were destroyed in 72 hours by Castro's speedily mobilized and well-armed militia. At the same time, Castro's police destroyed any possible simultaneous rising of the underground by arresting thousands of suspects. To do the wrong thing is bad, but to do it completely and incompetently is unforgivable. Castro's intelligence was aware of the military training in Guatemala. The three fighters sunk the supporting naval vessels, thus eliminating proper supply or escape. As well, the strafing and bombing was enough to occupy the landing force until Castro's soldiers arrived. So what happened with the airplanes was Cuba originally had 10 airplanes, and the U.S. actually did a bombing mission on the airport and took out 7 of the planes, but 3 planes escaped, and they never went after them. And as comes out later, that they knew about the 3 planes, and they also knew that these 3 planes were enough to foil the invasion. And we'll keep on going. The aftermath. The blow to American prestige from the Bay of Pigs was almost irretrievable. On the other hand, it greatly strengthened Castro's prestige in Latin America more than in Cuba itself, and made it possible for him to bind the Kremlin to his cause so tightly that it could neither reduce its support nor control his policies. This in turn permitted him to survive a deepening wave of passive resistance and sabotage within Cuba itself, chiefly from the peasants. And finally, as we shall see, this made it possible for him to recapture control of the Cuban revolutionary movement for himself and the Fidelistas from the Cuban communists. This last point was on March 9th, 1962, but the others began in 1961. Control of the economy was taken from Che Guevara and given to Professor Rodriguez, and Castro's brother Raul was appointed vice president. And before we get into the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'll just check in and see if there's any questions or comments.
Yeah, could you repeat what you were saying about Fletcher Prouty?
Well, I'm coming up to Fletcher Prouty in one of the slides in the near future. But Fletcher Prouty, he was, well, I can take away from some of the future slides. Fletcher Prouty was played as he was the character X in the movie JFK, and X was played by Donald Sutherland. And I've noticed throughout history, anytime something about the Kennedy assassination came up, he came up as a limited hangout or an intermediary character for some reason. He was directly under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he was a person that was supposed to implement the Bay of Pigs. And I have a little more on him coming up later. Is there anything that you wanted to add about Fletcher?
No, I was just, when I was listening to you, I kind of blanked out for a second and missed what you said about him. I was just curious.
Okay, no worries. I don't blame you for blanking out. I'm almost blanking out myself. So, anyways, we'll move on. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is a direct result of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. In the book itself, Quigley doesn't go into very much detail about the crisis. And I think there is quite a bit of information out about that, and so maybe he just left it like that. But I can just give you a quick summary. The Soviet commitment to Castro had been considerable, but not irretrievable. Soviet armaments began to arrive as early as July 1960. And in the first year exceeded 30,000 tons valued at 50 million. As payment, the communist bloc's portion of Cuba's export trade rose from 2% to 75%. Within a year of the failure at the Bay of Pigs, single Soviet military support for Castro doubled. It also changed its quality to late model anti-aircraft missiles, long-range missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, and even Soviet combat troops. By the time these changes became evident to Washington in October 1962, the Soviet military buildup in Cuba had cost over $700 million, and that's on page 720. And still, $700 million is quite a bit of change in those days. So. And I think the other thing, that people have noticed as a comparison, the Ukraine situation is almost the same, except the United States is the one doing the build-up, etc. So some people are saying that there may eventually be a new Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis itself, the increasing American area patrols over Cuba, which detected the Russian missile buildup on the island, were used by Cuba and the Soviet Union as evidence of the approaching American attack. By September, still unknown to the public, the crisis began to form, and in October it was in full progress with the consequences already described. For some reason, Quigley didn't really describe it. 720, and this quote's from 722. And this is what happened. After many long and difficult meetings, Kennedy decided to place a naval blockade or a ring of ships around Cuba. The aim of this quarantine, as he called it, was to prevent the Soviets from bringing in more military supplies. He demanded the removal of the missiles already there and the destruction of the sites on October 22nd. President Kennedy spoke to the nation about the crisis in a televised address. No one was sure how Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev would respond to the naval blockade and U.S. demands, but the leaders of both superpowers recognized the devastating possibility of nuclear war, and publicly agreed to a deal in which the Soviets would dismantle the weapon sites in exchange for a pledge from the United States not to invade Cuba. In a separate deal, which remained secret for more than 26 years, the United States agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. And on to the next slide. Epilogue. Kennedy continued speaking to Khrushchev and developed a relationship with Khrushchev against the advice of his advisors. This is important. I guess the Dulles brothers and the chiefs of staff were advising Kennedy not to communicate with Khrushchev, but they developed a relationship, and this there were some developments led to a teletype hotline between Kremlin and the White House, and also led to the signing of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty on July 25th, 1963. And the leaders in the Pakistani-Peruvian axis have little idea what to do once they get into power. As a result, they fall under the personal influence of unstable and ignorant men, the Nassers, the Perons, the Castros, who fall back on an emotionally charged program of hatred and spectacular displays of an unconstructive nationalism that wastes time and use up resources, while the real problems of the whole enormous area go unsolved. A heavy responsibility rests on the United States for this widespread failure to find solutions to problems, all the way from Pakistan to Peru. The basic reason for this is our policies in this great area have been based on efforts to find solutions to our own problems rather than theirs. Page 723, once again, the institutional drift. The Alliance for Progress, signed on August 17th, 1961, is another example of the failure of initiatives. Towards the end of the section, Quigley starts calling this the Dulles period and blames it for the failure of a Latin American policy. So we'll move to the next slide. I'll just, is there any questions or comments about the Cuban Missile Crisis or the section as a whole?
Nothing from my side, Dan. Thanks, sir.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know you're still alive. Anyway, so the next section I go into, like I usually do, the things that were missed or maybe underreported. And this quote is a classic from Donald Rumsfeld of, I think, both Bush administrations. And there are known unknowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know, but there also are unknown unknowns. These are things we don't know we don't know. So, one story some of you may have heard about is the story of Soviet submarine B-29. I really don't think people realize how close we were to some sort of major incident. This was revealed on October 14th, 1997, at a conference to commemorate the 35th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. An incident occurred on one of the submarines, B-59, when its captain, Valentin Savitsky, came close to using his nuclear torpedo. Although Americans weren't even aware of it at this time, it happened on the most dangerous day of the crisis, October 27th. Overflights by U.S. planes just 20 to 30 meters above the submarine tower, use of powerful searchlights, fire from automatic cannons of over 300 shells, dropping depth charges, cutting in front of the submarine by the destroyers at a dangerously small distance, targeting guns at the submarine, yelling from loudspeakers to stop engines. And because of this, the commander ordered an emergency dive, thinking that he was under attack and could have used nuclear weapons against the attacker. So there's seems to me there was a bit of provocation and a response, and I wonder why there was provocation, but I haven't. There's probably details kicking around somewhere on that. Arkhipov, who was still on the tower and saw the Americans had actually started signaling, not attacking, called the commander back and calmed them down. Savitsky's command was never transmitted to the officer in charge of the torpedo. So, I'm sure some of you may have heard of this. I just wanted to check in to see if anybody has any comments on this. Okay, so that's an unknown. Operation Northwoods. This is basically the Joint Chiefs of Staff decided that they wanted to do a false flag attack. These are some of the details of the attack, and they submitted this plan to Kennedy, and he refused to sign it. So I'm sure some of you have heard of that, and Quigley wouldn't. That would be an unknown for Quigley. The Monroe Doctrine. This would be a unknown. The Monroe Doctrine was articulated in President James Monroe's 7th annual message to Congress on December 2nd, 1823. The European powers, according to Monroe, were obligated to respect the Western Hemisphere as the United States sphere of interest. The Monroe Doctrine was invoked in 1865 when the U.S. government exerted diplomatic and military pressure in support of the Mexican president Benito Juarez. The support enabled Juarez to lead a successful revolt against Emperor Maximilian, who had been placed on the throne by the French government. Almost 40 years later, in 1904, European creditors of a number of Latin American countries threatened armed intervention to collect debts. President Theodore Roosevelt promptly proclaimed the right of the United States to exercise an international police power to curb such chronic wrongdoing in a so-called Roosevelt corollary or extension to the Monroe Doctrine. So, just a couple of comments on this. Quigley would have known about this. It may have had its reasoning, and he was trying to stick to a certain time period, but I still find that questionable. So I'm just asking the question: was the Monroe Doctrine was a Monroe Doctrine hangover responsible for future U.S. policy failure? And did the lack of foreign policy competition create a downward spiral of declining U.S. support and reciprocating decline in Latin and South American respect? Next slide. Who was Che Guevara? Well, Castro was a merciless tactician and strategist. Che Guevara represented the heart and soul of the revolution. With his George Clooney good looks and a different set of circumstances, Canada could be a very different country today. Che Guevara continued. His involvement started in Guatemala's social reforms under President Arbenz, whose eventual CIA-assisted overthrow at the behest of the United Fruit Company solidified Guevara's political ideology. After meeting the Castro brothers and joining the revolution, Guevara soon rose to prominence among the insurgents. He was promoted to second in command and played a pivotal role in the 2-year guerrilla campaign that opposed the Batista regime. After the Cuban Revolution, Guevara played a key role in the government that included reviewing the appeals and death sentence for those convicted, as war criminals during the revolutionary tribunals, instituting agrarian land reform as Minister of Industries, helping spearhead a successful nationwide literacy campaign, serving as both president of the National Bank, where he signed the notes. This is an aside. He signed the notes with the word Shay, 3 letters, no official signature. That's how much he despised central banking. And instructional director for Cuba's armed forces, and traversing the globe as a diplomat on behalf of Cuban socialism. So that's the question I'm asking. He was the heart and soul of Latin American Revolution, and Quigley barely mentioned him. So on to the next slide. He even, everybody talks about Castro addressing the United Nations. Guevara addressed the United Nations as well on December 11th, 1964. In an hour-long impassioned address at the UN, he criticized the United Nations' inability to confront the brutal policy of apartheid in South Africa. He denounced the United States policy towards their black population, and at the end of the speech hypothesized that a wave of anger would sweep the lands of Latin America and turn the wheels of history. So he was captured by Bolivian revolutionaries and the CIA on October 8th, 1967. He was executed. The interesting things here is both hands were removed from this corpse for fingerprinting. So I did just a little bit of investigation here, and just if you just ask one more question, you really are surprised at what you start to uncover. It was Hyksos who introduced the severing of the hands of enemies to Egypt, and it seems Egypt repaid them in kind, severing the hands of the Hyksos after the defeat and carefully curating their preparation arrangement in a public ceremony at the palace where they had once ruled. The act of mutilation ensured they'd never fight again and asserted the victor's dominance over the vanquished. This research was published in the journal Scientific Reports, and, well, you just have to hand it to them. So I'll move on to the next slide and just check in to see how everybody's doing. Any questions or comments? Maybe Darren, you want to, maybe you know something about Shay's involvement in South Africa.
Dan, I don't know too much about that part of South African history. When it comes to characters themselves, like Che Guevara, I do recall a lot of guys who participated in the border war. The South African Defence Force, were based in Namibia and Angola, and they had to confront Cuban soldiers and Cuban-trained African soldiers, ANC trained Cuban and Russian soldiers. And I mentioned it in, I think, the last time round. The South African Defence Force was defending democracy, and it was very much Western aligned and anti-communist, very, very, very much anti-communist. And the South African Defence Force was basically thumping everyone around them and doing very, very well. And it got to a point where the South African and Rhodesian armies could have completely taken the whole of Mozambique. Was there for the taking, and they received a notification from on high to go no further, and that order came from Henry Kissinger. So obviously there's a lot more going on than was realized at the time by the people on the ground. and that Kissinger, why was he supposedly supporting the enemy of the Americans? It didn't make sense at all to the soldiers that were losing their friends in the war. So yeah, the world is a stranger place, and Quigley makes it a lot less strange.
Yeah, and when you had mentioned that during the last session, and I didn't get the chance to speak. But the funny thing is we had General Patton saying the same thing about the campaign. He should have carried the campaign against Russian, and coincidentally, General MacArthur, after he salvaged the Korean War with his, he did a military marine landing and cut off the North Koreans, and they subsequently, because of that, they were losing drastically, and because of that move, they were able to salvage the operation. But he also submitted a plan to Truman to move on China that was rejected. So it's very interesting how these things just stop out of the blue. So thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so we'll move on to the Smith-Mundt Act. And I believe it, maybe some of you have heard of this, but this has bearings right up to this very day. The U.S. Information and Educational Exchange Act of 1948 was called the Smith-Mundt Act, and it was enacted in January 1945, and it was passed by Harry S. Truman in 1948. Basically, the act was developed to regulate broadcasting of programs for foreign audiences produced under the guidance of the State Department, and it prohibited domestic dissemination of materials produced by such programs as one of its provisions. So basically, it was they wanted to peel back the propaganda at home. It was okay to have propaganda in programs that were foreign, but they wanted to peel back the propaganda at home. But there was this, Obama initiated the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012, which allowed for materials produced by the State Department in the broadcasting and the Broadcasting Board of Governors to be made available within the United States. So basically, there was also a review in the Northwestern Law Review saying that this wasn't really a good thing. And who took advantage? Who was taking advantage of that? This is a series of articles by Joshua Stileman, starting in and around December 29, 2024, and proceeding into early January. The title of the articles is Engineering Reality, A Century of Cultural Control. And there was part 1, part 2, and part 3. I strongly suggest that people go and look at these articles. They fill in a lot of details about what Alan was talking about. They also fill in the story of Laurel Canyon, for example. So it's a really, really, really good series of articles. But I took this bit of evidence from that article. In 2012, Facebook conducted a secret experiment on 689,000 users, manipulating their news feeds to study how changes in content affected their emotions. The crude test was just a glimpse of what was coming. By 2024, algorithms would not be used to simply shape what we feel, but what we believe it is even possible to think. Social media platforms are now able to predict and modify behavior in real time, while streaming services automatically and continuously curate our cultural consumption, and digital payment systems track every single transaction. What began as a simple emotional manipulation has become comprehensive consciousness control. And this is another quote from Engineering Reality. And this is just the background, but he does quite a, well, I guess it would be a century-long review, and this really complements Alan's work. And I'll just do the quote here. The power to mold human perception didn't emerge overnight. The mechanisms of cultural control we see today were built over more than a century, evolving from Edison's physical monopolies to today's invisible digital chains. To understand how we arrived at this point of algorithmic consciousness control, and more importantly, how to resist it, we must first trace the historical foundations of these systems and the deliberate architecture of control that shaped them. The psychological manipulation revealed by the Facebook experiment may seem like a modern phenomenon, but its roots stretch back to the earliest days of mass communication. One of the first architects of cultural control was Thomas Edison, whose establishment of the Motion Picture Patents Company in 1908 laid the groundwork for a century of systemic influence. So in the Smith-Mundt Act being repealed, basically gave them an opportunity to start influencing behavior and thought. And of course, this was spearheaded and utilized effectively by none other than Barack Obama. Where am I now? Okay, when you stare into the abyss, it stares back at you. We'll have to remember, somebody will have to remember that quote for me towards the end. You know, even things like the Beatles and Rolling Stones, it's just amazing the depth of the efforts of these people. And this gentleman that wrote the article goes into this as well. The Beatles and Rolling Stones weren't just bands, as researcher Mike Williams has extensively documented in his analysis of the British invasion. Their emergence marked the beginning of a systemic and profound cultural transformation. Williams notes that even the term British invasion itself was telling, a military metaphor for what was ostensibly a cultural phenomena, perhaps Tavistock telegraphing its operation in plain sight. What seemed like playful marketing language actually described a carefully orchestrated infiltration of American youth culture. Through hundreds of hours of meticulously documented research, Williams builds an overwhelming case that the Beatles served as the spearhead of a broader agenda that used albums like Sgt. Pepper and the Rolling Stones, their Satanic Majesty's request, to deliberately steer youth culture away from traditional values and family structures. What seems tame by today's standards represented a calculated assault on social norms, initiating a cultural transformation that would accelerate over the following decades. So all this stuff was starting with the Dulles brothers, and it was happening concomitantly to the release of before and the release of Quigley's book in the mid-60s. So while I was researching the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, I decided to watch a video about Corporal Fletcher Prouty. And so the interesting thing was I decided to research out the video, or the organization that was producing these videos. in this time frame, and this was from November 11th, 92. And this I found, and I didn't have to really dig that deep for this. I think this maybe deserves a deep dive in light of what's happening now. But the main goals of the Lyndon LaRouche movement were restoration of the Glass-Steagall Act, a new Bretton Woods, advocating the abandonment of the floating exchange rate, espousing the American system of infrastructure projects, a regular banking system, and tariffs. Eurasian land bridge concept of high-speed rail, Greenland, Mars colonization, Musk, strategic defense initiatives surrounding direct beam weapons for use. So there's calling for an American Iron Dome. And for those of you that are up to date on California and Lahaina, it's just really strange how trees don't burn and how fire jumps without burning vegetation. I'll just leave it at that. Direct beam weapons for use against ICBMs, and the Fusion Energy Foundation movement that proclaims an interest in fusion energy and beam weapons. Just an aside, the hypersonic weapons that the U.S. is trying to achieve, but Russia and China have, involve a ball of plasma being developed in front of the weapon that allows it to reach extreme hypersonic speed. So I found that incredibly interesting. The other thing, a golden age, which seems to be coming up a lot lately. According to the Washington Post, LaRouche had told his followers that they are golden souls, a term from the Republic of Plato. In his 1979 autobiography, he contrasted the golden souls to the poor monkeys, the poor sheep whose consciousness is dominated by the infantile world outlook of individual sensuous life. Sound familiar? Jeffrey Steinberg, the show host, is listed as Director of Counterintelligence for the LaRouche Foundation, and Fletcher Prouty served as Chief of Special Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Kennedy years. He was directly in charge of a global system designed to provide military support for clandestine activities of the CIA. During the interview, he produced a paper trail showing how the Bay of Pigs was designed to fail in order to embarrass Kennedy. And once again, as I mentioned before, he was a character X in the movie JFK, was played by Donald Sutherland, who has an interesting family background as well. And Fletcher Prouty, was a limited hangout. Is this the conclusion? I'm sure some of you are asking this, but the interesting thing about all this is sometimes things happen out of the blue. For example, the information I just relayed to you about Fletcher Prouty and the LaRouche organization, and also just with respect to Che Guevara's body. Understanding Quigley's reality. While reading, I attempted to understand Quigley through his description, his time frame, and by what events he chose to minimize, maximize, or exclude from his writing. This is a question I wanted to ask before, but I didn't really get the chance to, because I had some technical issues. But I'm pretty convinced that Quigley was a polymath. During the last section, your weapons design was just impeccable. So he did have a physics undergrad, but for him to piece that together, he's a very bright guy. He was a Kennedy Democrat who was aware of Eisenhower's warning, and first and foremost, the students to think. Quigley retired from Georgetown in June 1976 after being honored by the student body with its faculty award for the 4th consecutive year. Understanding Quigley's reality continued. Latin America is congruent to his thoughts on neutrality. The United States foreign policy blunders, particularly in Cuba, but in the remainder of Americas as well, were facilitated by CIA insights and initiatives, particularly those of the Dulles brothers. The CIA operations in this time frame align with Quigley's views on institutional integration and the fall of civilizations. The explanation of disintegration is the gradual transformation of social instruments into institutions, that is, transformation of social arrangements functioning to meet real social needs into social institutions serving their own needs regardless of real social needs. So, and we showed that throughout Latin America and South America, and it's congruent with Quigley's theory of institutional drift. Institutional drift in Quigley's reality. All Western institutions, public or private, regardless of size, are affected whether internally or externally by institutional drift. Ipso facto. I have difficulty comprehending Quigley's eloquent prejudice in describing the Arabic traits of the Spanish Portuguese component of Latin and South America. We talked about that briefly before. Was his data set exhibiting a recency bias in the sense that the area in question was once a buffer zone of Spain and Portugal, and that the indigenous people were once a part of the great Mayan and Inca civilizations? It's difficult to understand Quigley's complete reality, or any reality for that matter. Inclusive diversity versus the dualism of Plato. From Quigley's study of history, it's clear that the West believes in diversity rather than uniformity, and pluralism rather than monoism or dualism, in inclusion rather than exclusion, in liberty rather than authority, and truth rather than power, and in conversion rather than annihilation, destruction. In the individual rather than in organization, and reconciliation rather than in triumph, and heterogeneity rather than in homogeneity, and relativism rather than absolutes, and in approximations rather than in final answers. The separation between mind and I'm going into dualism here, the separation between mind and body gave rise to what is known as substance dualism, the view that mental phenomena cannot be reduced to purely physical explanations. While physical sciences describe the laws governing physical events and properties, they fail to capture the subjective qualities of consciousness. And this sort of is tying, so Plato's tying into a lot of things that are going on today. And I think I just have 3 more slides, so we'll keep the questions to the end. So this is my limited attempt to align the realities of Quigley to the book club. I noticed that the book club's been progressing, and Melissa's presentations and Alan's talks have been progressing, and some of the supplemental videos, etc., have been in this regard, and it's a big question right now. So I was suffering from writer's block when writing the conclusion until I viewed a video from our friend Stein about artificial intelligence, and immediately thereafter watched a report from Dan Dix, who coincidentally and for some strange reason asked Grok to design a modern-day false flag operation using Operation Northwards as its template. Wow. And by the way, Sign, this morning my bridge to reality was walking out of the door and facing a north wind that rivaled the effect of smelling salts to start a frozen car with a dead battery. And I have to admit that viewing Net, the Unabomber, LSD, and the internet also challenged my thinking. Time constraints I've limited several topics, and I'm sure this applies to what I'm about to suggest. That's just simply resurrect Quigley and let him design an AI program to determine the current geopolitical status of today's blocks. Quigley the programmer. A polymath would probably make for a fairly competent programmer. The fact that he was acquainted with geopolitics and was aware of its nuances would give him a distinct advantage over programmers lacking that attribute. I think the challenge with a lot of AI programs is, for example, one that may be doing an English AI intelligence. If they don't have a background in English, they're just programming. They don't have the nuances. They just don't have the art. His diversity and inclusivity approach, combined with this individual institutional checklist, would provide a multifactorial design, and in today's environment would be successfully marketed. He would have to broaden his database to 6,000 years because there are competitors that have that breadth of data. For example, the Vatican or maybe the Freemasons. He would have to be more inclusive in his data and not miss items like the Smith-Mundt Act or the Monroe Doctrine. Success or failure. He would have to have an intelligence component to his operation to uncover the institutional drift like Tavistock, the Macy organization, which was extensively covered in the documentary Net, MK Ultra, the Soros Foundation, ... You understand. He would have to realize his limitations. He would probably have to hire Ted Kaczynski as a consultant. And this is why I'm saying this, and this is why we are in such, I won't say perilous, but such a controversial time. In 1930, mathematician Kurt Gödel shook the foundations of math with his incompleteness theorem. He demonstrated that in every formal logic system, there are problems that are non-solvable or conclusively determinable. And one example of that is the three-body problem. No matter what they have, they cannot solve positioning of three randomly moving objects. And he would have to be selective on who he shared this program with. So, into reality. Heinz von Forster, once again in the documentary Net, the central theme in cybernetics is feedback. Feedback is a process where the observed outcomes of actions are taken as inputs for further action in ways that support the pursuit, maintenance, or disruption of particular conditions, forming a circular causal relationship. So an example of this would be a heating or air conditioning system. So you have your thermometer, it records the heat, it turns if it's too cold, the furnace goes on. When it gets to the right temperature, the furnace goes off. So they discussed the cybernetics. He was a person that originated second order cybernetics. And his big question that he asked in the documentary is, and he was very old when he asked it, but he looked at the investigative reporter and just asked this question: what is reality? Can you show it to me too? So, And 2 more slides. Thanks for bearing with me. So another thing in this video, and it's a very popular saying, is the medium is the message. And over the last month, I've seen several interpretations of McLuhan's famous phrase, as well as several interpretations of Plato's allegory, The Cave. And these are all dealing with our perception of reality. And, you know, it's just really important to remember what Nietzsche said. There's no such thing as facts. There's only interpretation. And one interpretation from Net, the documentary, that just made the hair on my back stand up on edge is when one of the artists that they were consulting for the development of the internet said, basically, you become the tool. And I just wish I could reach into that video and just say to him, a 2-year-old with a hammer sees everything as a nail. So we'll end this with Marshall McLuhan, and probably a better saying. And basically, faced with information overload, we have no alternative but pattern recognition. And that's what Alan was the king of. He would recognize patterns and research them as much as he could to find the answer. And about this group here, we'll talk a little bit about second and third order cybernetics. But second order cybernetics was also observing the observer of the feedback loop. So they wanted to see if the observer had any biases or influences. And this goes on to third and fourth, etc. But this is why I wanted to remember the quote, sometimes when you look into the abyss looks back at you. Did they ever think that the people they were studying would be studying them? And that's what this group is doing. And that's what Alan has taught us to do. And I don't know, I have that thought. Maybe one of their anointed people has come up with this theory, but I'm not sure they realize that the abyss would be staring back at them. I was going to go into examples of Ask Polly versus Amazing Polly. You all know who she is, but this is why Alan's work is vital, and this is why it's been a real pleasure for me to do this work and share it with you today. So I hope I haven't put you all to sleep. Are there any questions or comments before we move into the sections with Graeme and Melissa?
I was thinking, Dan, very well done, by the way. No way you didn't put anybody to sleep. But I was thinking, what if the abyss they're staring into is only the pupil of the eye?
Could you elaborate on your thought for me?
That the abyss is a hell of a lot bigger than what they think, not in number, but in power, perhaps?
I'm beginning to think that it's just amazing. It's just amazing right now, and I really think that this whole questioning of reality that was brought up just in the presentations I've been watching. Maybe it's just the eye of the storm, because it is, but you have to realize that we're the leaders, and we have to figure out a way to to make this work. It's just the disconnects, just in, like, I can't speak like this to any group of people I know other than this group. I have to use Socratic method. I have to ask questions. I have to bump them along. I have to overturn a stone and walk away and then come back and overturn another stone. So I think we have to realize who we are, what we have to do, and how to do it. And I don't know if I've answered your query or not. Just, what do you think?
Absolutely. Like you said, outside of the word salad, there are so many unknowns that we truly are we don't know until, the time is right, and everything will just come together to help us. I believe that.
Yeah, I'd like to interject something.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Dan, I'd just like to commend you on that presentation. It was very interesting. I only blanked out for a second around the time you were first talking about Fletcher Prouty, but I just want to tell you, you did a good job.
Well, thank you. And Fletcher Prouty is not an easy name to remember. It's taken me at least 2 or 3 tries to remember that. And the other thing, when you start searching around, I was watching somebody last week who had written a book about Kennedy and was on with what's his name, Damelgard. He's a Kennedy and conspiracy researcher. Ole Demigard. And
yeah, I'm familiar with him.
Yeah, she had written a book. He was presenting her to somebody else, and she said after she wrote the book, one of her friends took her to a secret lunch at one of the clubs in Washington, and she sat down with a gentleman in a white uniform, and it was Fletcher Prouty, and he grilled her for about her book, and at the end told her it was very well written. And I think she used to work at the Pentagon. She was a secretary or admin assistant and was really good at accessing files. And she pieced together a lot that way. So he was quite impressed with that. But anyways, he keeps on showing up as a intermediary character when it comes to JFK. So thanks for your comment. Well, I guess I thank you very much for your attention, giving me the opportunity. I guess it's time to move on in our presentation.
Dan, thank you. That was really good. And you did a very good job of organizing everything. It was really interesting. I learned a lot. There were some things that were good for me to have in my head for picking up my section. We are breaking this recording into 2 parts so that it makes it more manageable listening for you. And so tune in a few days, hopefully, for the second part of this conversation that we had. And when we resume, Graeme will be talking about the disintegrating superblocks as that affected the Far East. And I will cover the eclipse of colonialism. So thank you for listening this far, and part 2 soon.